Сегодня праздник у девчат, сегодня будут танцы, и щеки девушек горят, с утра горят румянцем. Пришли, девчонки стоят, в сторонке платочки в руках теребят.
Good morning, everyone. Hope you're all having a wonderful day today. Today, we're going to be taking a look at the PWS Mark 116. But before we get into the video, full disclosure on this PWS upper that we're going to be taking a look at is that they did send this upper out to me for free for review, so I did not pay for it whatsoever. Several months ago, they reached out to me asking if there was something of theirs that I wanted to take a look at. I've used PWS products in the past with great success, so of course this is the option that I went with. This is the PWS 116, which is the 16-inch 223 wild variation, of course utilizing their proprietary long stroke piston system shoved into an AR-15 looking platform. Now, because there is a lot of interesting stuff to get into in this video, I do apologize for the length because we'll probably get into everything in a little bit of autismic detail. Now, starting off with the basics, this is of course a 16-inch rifle with a 223 wild chambering, and PWS is known for their interesting long stroke piston operating system, which we're going to get into in just a minute. Now, this may look very similar to an AR-15, and it may be compatible with standard AR-15 lowers. However, the only parts that are really compatible are going to be the charging handle and the muzzle device, and that's it. The barrel nut system is proprietary, the gas block system is proprietary, so it won't even work on aftermarket barrels. Of course, the BCG is attached to their long stroke piston system. The upper receiver is also different. You can't just use a standard mil-spec upper receiver. So there are really only two parts that are compatible with an AR-15. So it may look like an AR-15, it might fit on AR-15 lower receivers, but it doesn't operate like one, and it's not really all that compatible. Starting off from the front, the muzzle device is what I'm going to trademark as the Brashinator. That is a brake, flash hider, and compensator. And no, PWS, you can't steal that term from me, that is mine. And as a Brashinator, it actually does a pretty good job of taming the mild recoil on the PWS Mark 116, and without giving you too horrible of a sound signature or too bad of a flash signature either. There is a little bit of blast coming off the sides, but much less than what you'll find on a standard muzzle brake, so it does a good job of being a hybrid style muzzle device. Now, getting into the barrel, again, it is a 16-inch barrel chambered in 223 wild. If you're not familiar with 223 wild, it's kind of an in-between 223 and 5.56 chambering, designed to take the higher pressures of 5.56 while giving you some of the better accuracy characteristics of 223 wild. So it's a hybrid chamber to try and give you the best of both worlds. There have been some reports of durability issues in full auto systems in like a machine gun application because the chamber is not quite as strong as a true 5.56 chamber. However, if you're not using a PWS as a machine gun, which very, very few people probably are, probably not something you need to worry about. The barrel material is 4150 chrome molybdenum steel, and it is finished in a black nitride. Very standard, but that's not really a big deal. As we'll get into later on, the most important thing is that it is machined properly, and it's made out of a high quality steel to give you good accuracy. And we did get very good accuracy. I'll go ahead and spoil that right now, but the accuracy that I get out of this is fantastic. When we talk about the profile, it is definitely a middleweight profile, not a lightweight by any means. If I had to compare it to something, it would be similar to a Ballistic Advantage Hansen .750, maybe a tad heavier than that, maybe 1 or 2 ounces heavier in total, Certainly not a heavy profile, certainly not a government profile, not a lightweight barrel. Again, just right down the middle, which is kind of in the sweet spot, at least for me personally. Now, getting into the gas block, this is fairly complicated. So the gas block, piston regulator, whatever you want to call it, there's a lot going on here. So let's go ahead and start out with the installation. So this is essentially a large sleeve that is slid into place on the barrel. You'll notice on the barrel itself there is a notch cut out for a section on the back of the gas block that actually slides into the notch cut into the barrel. So alignment can never be an issue on the gas block. The gas block can only go onto the barrel in one spot, and that is a steel on steel contact that is never going to shift one way or the other. In front of the gas block, the barrel is actually threaded, and there is a locking ring that locks the gas block into position. So it cannot move forward and back, and it cannot move left and right because of steel on steel contact. Now, to remove the locking ring requires a special tool that I do not have, so I was not able to remove it to get in there, but just know that the assembly process and the way that the gas block is set up is essentially as bomb-proof as possible. Now, on top of the gas block up front, we have a 4-position gas regulator. We have an off setting. We have 3, which is our highest flow setting, 2, the medium flow setting, and 1, which is the lowest flow setting. We'll get into how those perform a little bit later on, but I will say that it's not a high, medium, low. It's more of a medium, medium, low, and then low, and then of course the final off setting. Now, all of this to say the gas block is set up perfectly, but there is a lot of steel here, which means that it is going to be heavier, which is going to play into the weight of the upper as we move a little bit further on. Now, before we actually talk about the long stroke piston system, we have to talk about the piston sleeve, which is essentially a steel tube that goes from the gas block all the way into the barrel nut and into the upper receiver because they're all timed together, which is a incredibly robust system, though again, keep in mind that this is a lot of steel on your gun, and there are gas ports cut into the bottom of the piston sleeve that get progressively larger to vent off more and more gas as the piston operates. This is done to relieve some of that excess pressure, and it's also going to bleed those gases off down into the barrel inside of the handguard rather than pushing them through the upper receiver and into your face, which does help it to not only feel a little bit better when shooting, but also to keep more of those gases further away from you, which is always a good thing and one of the benefits in general of running a piston operating system. Now, getting into the piston itself, this is a long stroke piston, meaning that it is a 1-piece, or in this case a 2-piece, from the BCG all the way to the gas block. A short stroke piston system would have a separate piece in the gas block that would hit an op rod that would then hit your BCG. That's a short stroke piston system, but again, with the long stroke piston system, it is 1 unit. Now, the piston itself is attached to the BCG, which we'll get into in just a minute. It does separate in the middle so that you can get your charging handle out. You can swap the charging handle out with whatever you want, but the charging handle that is included is a Radian Raptor LT, which most people are probably fine with. Now, it is fairly simple to separate the 2 pieces. You must rotate the front part of the operating rod to the flat section where you can remove it. It only comes off one way, and to make sure that it doesn't rotate or move when firing, there is a detent on one side and an indent on the other to make sure that it maintains pressure at all times. Moving back to the BCG, we'll go ahead and start out with the staking on the very interesting gas key that of course holds your op rod. This is some of the most aggressive staking I have ever seen. Now, it would be somewhat interesting if they had done what LWRC had done and made the actual gas key itself a singular piece with the rest of the carrier, which I think would be stronger. However, the way they have it set up is very, very robust. There is a lot of extra material here. However, it is still staked to the carrier, so it is a separate piece, which does cause some possibility of breakage there. And one thing of note is that they're not using true grade 8 fasteners, they're actually using YFS fasteners, which I'm not sure why they're doing that. The only gas key screws that I've ever sheared off were YFS screws. I've never had an issue with true grade 8 fasteners. The staking is ridiculous, they're never going to loosen on their own, but in theory they could shear off. Now again, I'm not sure what the actual torque value on them is versus like a DI system, it's theoretically possible that there's a higher torque value, tension, or twist value on a DI system versus this long stroke piston system. I imagine they've done their testing, and through about 2,000 rounds, I haven't had an issue so far. Now, as far as the rest of the carrier goes, the geometry is very interesting, and it's designed to increase carrier stability. For instance, in the back of the carrier, it actually has a enlarged section to have a tighter fit in your buffer tube and in your upper and lower receiver to make sure that it's not bouncing around, because of course you have a physically long op rod that is impinging slightly off axis. So you want to make sure that you're not beating up the back of your lower receiver or upper receiver and having carrier tilt. So to remove some of that carrier tilt, they've enlarged the back of the carrier to make sure that it has a little bit of a tighter fit. You also have some of the front rail sections removed in the middle, and there are no gas vents on the carrier itself because of course there are no gas rings on the bolt, because that is just not how this system operates. Now, talking about the bolt, they didn't really go into specifics on the website of what the bolt is made out of. I'm going to imagine it's 9310. People usually like to brag if they're using Carpenter 158. Again, I'm not sure how the difference in terms of pressures that they're getting with the long stroke piston operating system versus a DI. The general thought is that, or the general consensus is that long stroke piston, short stroke piston are a little bit harder than DI, but again, you're also not dealing with the same level as heat since you're not getting those gases coming back through the carrier and the bolt. And there are certain aspects of durability on the system that I just don't have enough ammunition to test. I would need to put somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 rounds through probably 5 different PWS systems, and then a comparable amount of rounds through a comparable high quality standard DI AR-15 system. And again, I just don't have access to that much time or ammo. Now, getting into the handguard itself, this is of course the Mod 2 version. The Mod 1 has a little bit simpler, just straight M-LOK rail, and it is actually going to be a little bit cheaper as well. And that is actually going to overall still be my favorite, but there might be some reasons why you as the individual might like the Mod 2 more. So the Mod 2 rail on this 16-inch upper is the 15-inch pick lock version. So at the end, you have inline Picatinny machined into the rail. Most quad rails, like the Geisley Mark IV rails, they have extended Picatinny sections at the end, and then the rest of the rail is machined down. This is much slimmer and much more inline, so it's adding very, very little weight, and you get that Picatinny at the end. Now, for this video specifically, I was using a Picatinny bipod and a Picatinny light, the Streamlight ProTac HLX or something like that, all attached via Picatinny. Picatinny is an incredibly strong mounting solution. It's much stronger than M-LOK, but it is of course a little bit bigger and a little bit heavier. So depending on what items you're using, you may like that versus the straight M-LOK. Now, in terms of the rail itself, it is a very, very slim rail, and there is a lot of material removed. And I don't just mean for the gas regulator up front. I mean that there is not a lot of connective tissue between the M-LOK at the 3, 6, and 9 and the full pick up top. Now, that being said, this gun has been dropped, I think 4 to 6 times at this point because I've used it for a lot of different videos, and I haven't had any issues with the handguard bending or shifting. There is some material between. I don't want to make it seem like it's very flimsy and it's just going to bend on the first drop or the first bump, but it's not necessarily the most confidence inspiring. Now, when you compare that to the Mod 1 rail, which it might be at the end of the day without the Picatinny up front, it might be 1 ounce heavier or so. It still has M-LOK at the 3, 6, and 9. It's a little bit less slim, and the lockup is going to be a little bit better, but we haven't gotten to that part yet. It has a lot more connective tissue, and I just am sure that that rail is a little bit more rigid if that's something that you're worried about. Now, moving back to the lockup, this is using a wedge clamp notch system. It is very interesting. There's a lot going on with it, and a lot of engineering went in to make sure that this rail had as much contact as possible. So we'll just go ahead and get into it. So the most obvious thing is you have 2 clamps on the bottom that are steel on steel action, which is nice, that have these fairly diminutive cross bolts holding them in place. On one of the little locking blocks, there is a tiny little notch that acts like a wedge/alignment piece that fits into a tiny little notch in the barrel nut to make sure that it can't move forward or back. And I'm not sure if it applies enough direct pressure to really act like a wedge. However, on the top of the handguard, there's also a notch cut out that slides over a protrusion on the top of the barrel nut/piston housing alignment section. Again, there's a lot going on with this barrel nut. I would absolutely hate to have to install one of these things, and I would hate to have to take one apart as well. Fortunately, PWS takes care of all of that. That does slot in very tightly into the handguard. So they do fit together as one piece, and then you have a clamp/wedge on the bottom to make sure that it can't move one way or the other. So it is essentially locked down. I don't have any fears of it shifting one way or the other because it really can't unless the rail itself bends. Now again, when comparing that to the Mod 1 rail, the Mod 1 rail has a non-circular barrel nut, so the handguard itself cannot rotate ever left, right, up, or down. And then it has 6 bolts holding it, 6 steel bolts holding the rail to the barrel nut. It is again a little bit bigger, a little bit heavier, and at the end of the day, it's a little bit simpler and, at least in my opinion, a little bit more robust. Take that into consideration that it's also a little bit cheaper, and I think the Mod 1 for me is overall better. But if you're looking for Picatinny and you want the slimmest rail possible, then the Mod 2 is something you might want to look at. Now moving on to the upper receiver, this is the one component where they're saving a little bit of weight. So it is a 7075 forged aluminum upper receiver that has these very beautiful aesthetic cuts into it, and they have omitted the forward assist, so they are saving a little bit of weight here. It is 7075, which I do like, again, made from a forging, all fantastic. Again, not quite standard to an AR-15, because where your gas tube would be, of course, on this upper receiver, that is actually bored out quite a bit so that they can fit the piston alignment or the piston sleeve in place, because of course it needs a much larger hole for the actual long stroke piston system to operate in. As far as the upper receiver goes, M4 feed ramps, it's lightweight, it's trim, standard dust cover, no issues there whatsoever. The charging handle, as I mentioned, it is the Radian Raptor LT. I'm not the biggest fan of the LT, but overall I think it is, again, serviceable. So now we get to talk about performance, and this is the part where the PWS absolutely does the best. Now, when we talk about shootability on a PWS, you have to talk about the gas settings, and these are probably the best spaced gas settings in the game. So, starting out, you have 3 regular settings and then 1 off. 3 is going to be your highest flow, though it is not what I would consider to be a high setting. It's definitely more of a medium setting. On setting 1, when unsuppressed with high quality ammunition and let's say an H2 buffer, which is what they recommend to slow down the long stroke piston operating system a little bit, you're going to be getting ejection around 2 o'clock, which is a little bit overgassed. Moving down to setting 2, you're going to be getting ejection right around 3:30 when unsuppressed, again with that heavier buffer. When you throw on a suppressor, you're really not moving that ejection pattern all that much. You probably bump it up to about 3 o'clock with high quality ammo. In some of the video, you'll see me using cheap steel cased ammunition on setting 2 with a suppressor, and it's ejecting that perfectly with an H3 buffer, which is one of the new CAC buffers that has like the part where the front part of the buffer moves in a little bit, so it's kind of like a dual stage buffer. It's interesting, we'll talk about that at a future point in time, but that is a H3 weight buffer, steel cased ammunition on setting 2, ejecting beautifully right at about 3 to 3:30. With absolute full power ammunition and the highest backflow suppressor that you could imagine, you can run it on setting 3 with an H2 or H3 buffer. I really never had to use setting 3. That would again be for very hot ammo. Maybe you're stuck in a situation where you're not using a heavier buffer. Maybe you have a lightweight spring or your spring's a little weaker than it needs to be. That and a really high backflow can, and you're sitting on setting 3. But for me, in about 2,000 rounds of shooting, anything from the weakest ammo imaginable all the way up to the good stuff, setting 2 has been the workhorse that has worked again about 90-95% of the time. Now, I've also used it with rifle length buffers, I've used it with an A5 system, I've used it with the shorter CAC buffers, again, the new ones that we'll talk about at a future point in time, as well as standard H2 and H3 buffers. Again, setting 2, almost always works perfectly. And when it's set up properly, whether suppressed or unsuppressed, it is a very, very flat shooting upper. When I'm using their Brashinator, there's virtually no recoil whatsoever. It feels fantastic. You barely even notice that there's a lot more weight reciprocating with that long stroke piston system. Now, when suppressed without the Brashinator, you do feel a little bit more recoil, and so it still feels great. And again, the gas adjustments are basically perfect, so I don't have any problems there, but it's not going to be quite as nice as a fully tuned AR-15. For instance, there was one range session where I was shooting the PWS back to back with my modern dissipator, and the modern dissipator, still a 16-inch barrel, rifle length gas system tuned with a suppressor, and that shot lights out and much better than the PWS. So the PWS feels great suppressed and unsuppressed, but it's still not going to compete with a really, really well-tuned AR-15, and that's really not what it's designed to do. When suppressed on the PWS system, you do notice significantly less gas back to the face. That is because the gas is of course getting vented in the gas regulator up front, and they're also venting some of that out of the tube well before it ever hits your face. Now, it's not going to mitigate all of the back pressure because you're still getting back pressure down the bore. The only real way to do that is to use a actual flow-through can. But if you take a high back pressure can like the YHM cans that I use and compare them versus a 16-inch DI gun versus the PWS, you're going to be getting significantly less gas to the face, so it has a higher level of shootability in that regard. One note is that a lot of people think that a piston system runs cleaner, and I'm actually going to counterpoint that and say not really. So while a DI system does of course vent those gases directly back through the bolt carrier group, the long stroke piston system doesn't vent any of those gases through, so they kind of just sit there and build up crud. This is one of the dirtiest systems that I've seen, and again, I shot it probably about 90% suppressed. Really only the first range session I used the Brashinator. After that, I shot it basically suppressed 100% of the time unless I was shooting for groups, and it got very, very gross. So while it might technically be a little bit cleaner, it still just deposits the gunk there, and because it's not actively forcing them through and expelling them out the side, it kind of just sits there on the bolt carrier group, so it still gets very dirty. The main benefit is that it feels better shooting suppressed, and you don't get those gases flung back in your face quite like you would with a DI system. Now, talking about reliability, it was 100% reliable, so pretty easy there. Now, moving on to accuracy. Accuracy was, as expected, fantastic. Every PWS upper that I've shot without fail, for some reason, has shot very, very well. On the PWS Mark 111 that I reviewed originally, I was able to get, I believe, 1 or 2 1MOA groups out of it with different ammunition. And with the Mark 116, which I've already tested twice now for accuracy, I was able to get some very, very good groups out of it. And I'm not sure what they're doing. Again, it is just a 4150 chrome moly vanadium steel black nitride finish. Maybe it's the little bit of extra weight they're putting in there or some other black magic that they're doing, but I can usually get very, very good groups out of them. This upper receiver I've taken out to 600 yards with the Vector Continental 1-10 by 28, which we'll talk about next week. But it's a very, very easy process to do. 16-inch guns are very nice in terms of their ballistics. Yeah, they're a little bit long and heavy with the suppressor, which we'll talk about in just a second, but the PWS Mark 116 shoots very well for a piston system, and it's also very accurate to boot. So, what is the problem with it then? Well, if you've been paying attention and adding up some of the things in your head, you'll note that this is gonna be a little on the heavy side. I would warrant it's probably about 8 ounces heavier than a comparable DI setup, just because of all of the extra steel in here. You're gonna get a lot more weight on the gas block, the op rod system, the piston sleeve, and the bolt carrier group are all heavier, so you probably have, and of course the barrel nut, don't forget the barrel nut is also very interesting. So you have a lot of extra steel, and I do mean steel here, so you are probably looking at about an extra 8 ounces. Now, I like 16-inch guns. They are definitely do everything. They're not too long like some people think, but I will say when you're running a suppressor plus a light out front, it gets very heavy very quickly, and a 16-inch gun starts to feel like a 24-inch gun when you've got a somewhat heavy system to begin with, plus about a pound of a suppressor and adapter, and then another half pound of a light out front. It feels very heavy very quickly. So the two main drawbacks of the PWS system that you're not really going to be able to get away from, number one is very objective, that's just the weight. There's just a lot of steel in here, and it is going to be a little bit heavier of a platform than a standard AR-15. And number two is somewhat subjective, and it's obviously going to depend on what you're comparing it against, but it does recoil a little bit more than like a standard AR-15. Now, when we get to value, these upper receivers are priced anywhere from $1,300 to $1,400. Again, keep in mind that the Mod 1 uppers are a little bit cheaper as well, and that's going to slot in right next to Geisley, ADM, Daniel Defense, and name your other high-end AR manufacturer. The difference here is instead of being a basic, or I shouldn't say basic, a standard-ish AR-15 setup, you are getting something that is truly different and is going to offer you some advantages, especially when it comes to suppressed shooting. Now, that does come at a trade-off of weight and some recoil, but it's going to be up to you whether or not it's worth it. In terms of my personal experience with PWS, they have been on par with almost as accurate as Geisley and almost as, well, I shouldn't say almost as reliable. They've both been basically identical, which is perfect. But in terms of weight, they are going to be a little bit heavier, and I would give the edge to accuracy to the Geisley barrels, and the Geisleys are also going to be, cold hammer forge, chrome line, taper profile, a little bit lighter as well, of course. So there are going to be some pros and cons, and it's really going to come down to whether or not you want that long stroke piston operating system. For me personally, because this exists, I don't know why you would ever go with something like an AK. So a nice AK runs what, $2,000 to $3,000 for like a rifle dynamics on the low end or something, and this is going to shoot lights out compared to that. Way more accurate, way more modular. Of course, it's not compatible with a lot of standard AR-15 stuff, but you can mount stuff where you want. It's going to be lighter than an AK, so that's not really a complaint. And unless you're just dying for something chambered in 7.62 by 39, which is quickly drying up here in the US, and you need those AKM pattern mags, there's just real no reason to go with a high-end AK versus something like a PWS. So there is just about everything I have to say on the PWS Mark 116. Again, it is a very reliable system. It does work quite well. It's soft shooting enough for a piston system. It's also very accurate, and it's price competitive with other options on the market. For instance, it's going to compete very close to Geisley, ADM, a little bit above BCM, a little bit underneath DD. But again, it's in that same price category of other top tier AR manufacturers, and it performs like them while being completely different in its operating mechanism. So is it right for you? Maybe. It's really going to come down to whether or not you think that long stroke piston system is worth it over a more traditional DI system. You're still getting high quality components, it's still going to function very well, but the main difference is going to be the operating system of the actual upper receiver. But with all that out of the way, guys, let me know what you guys think of the PWS Mark 116 Mod 2-M in the comments down below. And with all that out of the way, guys, thank you so much for watching. I hope you all enjoyed. I will see you in the next one. God bless.